It was a chilly autumn evening in London, the kind where the air feels crisp against your skin and the sky glows with hues of orange and purple as the sun sets. Buckingham Palace stood tall and majestic, its grandeur illuminated by soft golden lights that reflected off the polished stone walls. Around it, life buzzed with energy. Tourists from all over the world gathered, snapping photos, pointing at the iconic red uniforms of the royal guards, and chatting excitedly about how lucky they were to witness such history up close. Among the crowd, there was Mark, a man in his late 30s whose face carried traces of weariness. His clothes were slightly rumpled, and his hair stuck out in odd directions, like he hadn't bothered to comb it in days. Mark had been having a rough time lately. Just 2 weeks earlier, his long-term relationship ended abruptly, leaving him feeling lost and empty. He tried to fill that void with distractions, work, movies, even long walks, but nothing seemed to help. That day, he found himself sitting alone at a small pub not far from the palace, nursing one drink after another until hours slipped away unnoticed. By the time Mark stepped outside, the cool night air hit him hard. His mind felt fuzzy, and his steps wobbled as he wandered aimlessly toward the palace gates. The streets were alive with laughter and chatter, but Mark barely noticed. All he could think about was how unfair life felt right now. Why did everything have to go wrong? What had he done to deserve this pain? As he approached the palace, his eyes landed on the royal guards standing perfectly still, their bearskin hats towering above them. They looked almost robotic, completely unaffected by the chaos around them. Some tourists were poking fun, waving their hands in front of the guards' faces or making silly poses for pictures. Others laughed at the absurdity of trying to get a reaction from these stoic figures. But no matter what happened, the guards didn't move a muscle. Mark stopped in his tracks, staring at one guard in particular. This guard seemed different somehow, not because of his appearance, but because of the way he commanded respect without saying a word. There was something infuriating yet fascinating about his unwavering focus. Mark's chest tightened with anger. How could anyone stay so calm while people mocked them? Didn't they care? Or were they just pretending? The more Mark thought about it, the angrier he became. His fists clenched, and his breathing grew heavier. He glanced down and saw an empty beer bottle lying near his feet. Without thinking twice, he bent down, picked it up, and weighed it in his hand. The glass felt cold and solid, and suddenly, an idea sparked in his alcohol-fueled brain. If this guard wouldn't react to jokes or teasing, maybe this would get his attention. The crowd around him continued laughing and talking, oblivious to the storm brewing inside Mark. No one noticed the tension building in his body or the reckless determination flashing in his bloodshot eyes. For a moment, he hesitated, wondering if he should really do what he was thinking. But then, fueled by frustration and liquid courage, he made up his mind. With a grunt, he pulled his arm back and hurled the bottle straight toward the guard's head. Time seemed to slow down as the bottle sailed through the air, spinning end over end before colliding with the side of the guard's helmet with a loud clang. The sound echoed sharply, cutting through the noise of the crowd like a knife. Gasps rippled through the onlookers, and everyone froze, unsure of what would happen next. Would the guard retaliate? Would security come rushing in? All eyes turned to the scene, waiting anxiously for the fallout. The loud clang of the beer bottle hitting the guard's helmet hung in the air like an invisible shockwave, silencing the once lively crowd. For a split second, everything seemed frozen. Mark stood there with his arm still extended from the throw, his chest heaving as if he'd just run a marathon. The tourists who had been laughing moments ago now stared in stunned disbelief, their mouths hanging open. Some instinctively took a step back, while others pulled out their phones to record the unfolding drama, whispering nervously among themselves. But the guard didn't move, not even a twitch. Corporal James Whittaker remained perfectly still, his posture unwavering despite the force of the impact. His eyes stayed fixed straight ahead, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. It was almost surreal, like watching a statue come under attack but refusing to crumble. The only evidence that something had occurred was the faint dent on the side of his polished black helmet, glinting slightly under the dim streetlights. Mark blinked, momentarily confused by the lack of reaction. He had expected, well, something. Maybe the guard would shout, or turn his head sharply, or even reach for his weapon. Anything but this eerie calmness. Instead, Whittaker stood there as if rooted to the spot, embodying the very definition of discipline and restraint. To Mark, it felt personal, as though the guard was deliberately ignoring him, mocking him silently. Fueled by frustration and embarrassment, Mark's face flushed red. "Hey," he yelled, his voice slurred but loud enough to carry across the square. "You think you're so tough? Huh? Why won't you fight back?" He stumbled forward a few steps, pointing an accusatory finger at the guard. "What are you, some kind of robot? Come on, man, say something." His words echoed into the night, but the guard didn't respond. Not a single movement betrayed emotion. Not even a flicker of irritation crossed Whittaker's face. If anything, his composure seemed to deepen, radiating an aura of quiet strength that only made Mark angrier. "Why aren't you doing anything?" Mark shouted again, his voice rising higher. "Is this some sort of game to you? You think you're better than me?" Each question came out more desperate than the last, revealing cracks in his bravado. Deep down, he knew he was acting foolishly, but the alcohol coursing through his veins drowned out any rational thought. All he cared about in that moment was getting a reaction, any reaction, from the man standing before him. By now, the crowd had formed a loose circle around them, murmuring anxiously. Some people looked horrified, shaking their heads at Mark's behavior. Others whispered about how brave, or crazy, the guard must be to endure such provocation without flinching. A few children clung to their parents' legs, wide-eyed, and unsure whether to cry or stay silent. The atmosphere was thick with tension, like a storm cloud hovering just above their heads. Still, Whittaker stood firm. His breathing was steady, his expression neutral. Even the slight breeze ruffling his uniform couldn't break his focus. Every second that passed felt heavier, amplifying the awkwardness and unease in the air. Mark began pacing back and forth, muttering curses under his breath. He clenched and unclenched his fists, searching for another way to provoke the guard into responding. But no matter what he did, Whittaker remained immovable, a human wall of patience and resolve. As the seconds ticked by, Mark's anger started to shift into something else. Confusion. Why wasn't the guard fighting back? Why wasn't he calling for help or raising the alarm? Wasn't this supposed to be his chance to prove himself, to show everyone just how strong and capable he was? Yet here he stood, silent and unyielding, making Mark look increasingly foolish with each passing moment. For the first time since throwing the bottle, doubt crept into Mark's mind. What if he'd gone too far? What if this wasn't going to end the way he imagined? But before he could fully process these thoughts, something inside him snapped. Whether it was guilt, fear, or sheer frustration, he couldn't tell. All he knew was that he couldn't stop himself from shouting one last challenge. "You coward!" Mark bellowed, his voice cracking with emotion. "You're nothing but a statue in fancy clothes. Do you even care about what's happening right now?" And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, the guard moved. When the guard finally moved, it wasn't with the explosive energy Mark had been expecting. Instead, Corporal James Whittaker took a single, deliberate step forward, just enough to break his rigid stance without abandoning his post completely. The motion was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it sent a ripple through the crowd. Gasps and murmurs erupted as people leaned in, trying to figure out what would happen next. Even Mark froze mid-rant, his mouth hanging open like he'd forgotten how to speak. For the first time since the incident began, Whittaker shifted his gaze. Slowly, carefully, he turned his head toward Mark, not aggressively, but with a quiet intensity that made everyone around them hold their breath. His eyes locked onto Mark's, piercing through the haze of alcohol and anger. There was no malice in his expression, no hint of revenge or disdain. Instead, there was something else, understanding. It was as if Whittaker could see past the drunken bravado and into the raw pain simmering beneath. "Young man," Whittaker said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the tension like a knife. "I understand you're upset, but violence solves nothing." The words hung in the air, simple yet powerful. They weren't shouted or spat out in anger. They were spoken with a measured tone that commanded attention. Even the rowdiest tourists fell silent, their phones lowered as they absorbed the gravity of the moment. Mark blinked, his jaw slackening. He hadn't expected this, certainly not kindness or empathy from someone he'd just attacked. His mind raced, struggling to process what was happening. Whittaker didn't wait for a response. Instead, he straightened his posture slightly, regaining the formal composure expected of a royal guard, but kept his focus on Mark. "We all have bad days," he continued, his voice steady and reassuring. "But lashing out won't fix anything. Trust me, I've seen it before." Mark felt his knees wobble. The world around him seemed to spin, the weight of Whittaker's words hitting him harder than any physical blow ever could. For weeks, he'd bottled up his emotions, letting bitterness fester inside until it exploded in reckless behavior. And now, here was this stranger, a man who had every right to be furious, offering him compassion instead of retaliation. It was disarming, unnerving, and strangely humbling all at once. The crowd watched intently, their earlier amusement replaced by genuine curiosity. Some people exchanged glances, nodding slowly as though Whittaker's words resonated with them too. Others simply stared, captivated by the surreal exchange unfolding before their eyes. No one dared to interrupt or laugh anymore. The atmosphere had shifted entirely, from chaotic and tense to somber and reflective. Mark's chest tightened as tears welled up in his eyes. He tried to blink them away, embarrassed by the sudden swell of emotion. But it was useless. The dam holding back his feelings had cracked wide open, and there was no stopping it now. His hands trembled as he dropped them to his sides, his earlier defiance melting away like snow under the sun. I'm sorry," Mark stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked down at his feet, unable to meet Whittaker's gaze. Shame washed over him in waves, making his whole body feel heavy. How could he have been so stupid, so reckless? All those months of pent-up frustration, and this was how he chose to express it, by hurling insults and projectiles at a complete stranger. Whittaker didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood there, giving Mark space to process his emotions. His presence was neither intimidating nor dismissive. It was patient, almost fatherly. When he finally spoke again, his tone was softer, tinged with warmth. "It's okay to feel hurt," he said gently. "But remember, you're stronger than your pain. Don't let it control you." Those final words struck a chord deep within Mark. Tears streamed freely down his face now, mingling with the chill of the autumn night. He sank to his knees, overwhelmed by guilt, regret, and a strange sense of relief. The crowd parted slightly, creating a small circle around him, their earlier judgment replaced by sympathy. Some even looked at Whittaker with admiration, marveling at how he'd handled such a volatile situation with grace and dignity. In that moment, Mark realized something profound. True strength wasn't about fighting back or proving yourself. It was about staying calm when others couldn't, showing kindness when it was least deserved, and choosing understanding over anger. And standing before him was living proof of that lesson. A man whose quiet courage spoke louder than any words ever could. As Mark knelt on the cold pavement, his body trembling and tears streaming down his face, the world around him seemed to blur. The bright lights of Buckingham Palace, the murmurs of the crowd, even the crisp autumn air, all of it faded into the background. For the first time in weeks, maybe even months, Mark wasn't thinking about the pain of his breakup or the anger that had been boiling inside him. Instead, he was consumed by a single, overwhelming emotion: shame. He replayed the events of the past few minutes in his mind over and over again, each memory hitting him like a punch to the gut. He saw himself picking up that beer bottle, hurling it with reckless abandon, shouting insults at a man who hadn't done anything to deserve it. And then there was Corporal Whittaker, calm, composed, and kind, even after being attacked. How could someone show such restraint? How could they respond to cruelty with compassion? Mark's chest tightened as guilt weighed heavily on him. He wanted to disappear, to sink into the ground, and never come back. But instead, he stayed where he was, his head bowed low, unable to look anyone in the eye. His hands clenched into fists, not out of anger this time, but out of frustration with himself. What must these people think of him? What must Whittaker think of him? The crowd remained eerily quiet, their earlier whispers now replaced by an almost reverent silence. Some tourists shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to leave or stay. Others stood frozen, watching the scene unfold with expressions ranging from pity to awe. A young woman holding her child's hand wiped away a tear, moved by the raw humanity of the moment. Even those who had initially laughed at Mark's drunken antics now looked at him with sympathy, realizing that behind his aggression lay a man who was clearly hurting. Meanwhile, Corporal Whittaker continued to stand tall, his presence both commanding and calming. Though his duty required him to remain focused on his post, he couldn't help but feel a pang of empathy for the broken man before him. Whittaker had seen plenty of difficult situations during his years of service, people lashing out because of stress, fear, or pain. But something about Mark struck a chord. Perhaps it was the vulnerability in his voice, the way his defenses crumbled so quickly once confronted with kindness. Whatever it was, Whittaker knew this wasn't just another chaotic night at the palace gates. It was a moment of reckoning. For Mark, and perhaps for everyone watching. After what felt like an eternity, Mark finally managed to lift his head. His eyes were red and puffy, his cheeks streaked with tears, but there was a new clarity in his gaze. Gone was the haze of alcohol-fueled rage, replaced by a deep sense of remorse. I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he choked out, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. "I'm so sorry." Whittaker nodded slightly, acknowledging the apology without saying a word. There was no need for grand speeches or dramatic gestures. Sometimes silence spoke louder than anything else. Still, Whittaker understood that Mark needed more than just forgiveness. He needed guidance. So, after a brief pause, he spoke again, his tone gentle yet firm. "It's okay to make mistakes," Whittaker said, his words carrying a quiet authority that demanded attention. "What matters is what you do next. You've already taken the first step by apologizing. Now, it's up to you to decide how you want to move forward." Mark listened intently, hanging on to every word. It was strange. Here was a man he'd wronged, offering him advice instead of condemnation. In that moment, Whittaker wasn't just a royal guard. He was a symbol of resilience, patience, and grace. Mark realized that he had a choice. He could let this incident define him as a failure, or he could use it as a turning point, a chance to confront his demons and start rebuilding his life. The thought terrified him, but it also gave him hope. For so long, he'd been stuck in a cycle of self-pity and destructive behavior, convinced that he was powerless to change. But now, kneeling there in front of Whittaker and surrounded by strangers who had witnessed his lowest moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in ages: possibility. As the seconds ticked by, the tension in the air began to ease. The crowd, sensing that the worst was over, started to disperse slowly, some casting final glances at Mark and Whittaker before walking away. A few lingered, whispering quietly among themselves, while others simply stood there, reflecting on what they'd just seen. It wasn't every day you witnessed such a powerful display of humanity. And then, just as Mark was beginning to gather the courage to stand up, Whittaker signaled subtly to a nearby officer. The message was clear. Mark needed help, and it was time to ensure he got it. As the nearby officer approached, Mark instinctively flinched, half expecting to be handcuffed and dragged away. After all, he had just committed a blatant act of aggression against a royal guard, a serious offense in any book. But instead of barking orders or reaching for restraints, the officer knelt down beside him, mirroring Whittaker's calm demeanor. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the dim streetlights, but his expression was soft, almost fatherly. He placed a reassuring hand on Mark's shoulder, not to intimidate, but to steady him. "It's going to be okay," the officer said quietly, his voice firm yet kind. "Let's get you somewhere safe." Mark blinked through his tears, stunned by the unexpected gentleness. For someone who had spent the evening drowning in anger and self-pity, this sudden wave of compassion felt surreal. He opened his mouth to protest, to insist that he deserved punishment, but no words came out. Instead, he nodded weakly, allowing the officer to help him to his feet. His legs wobbled like a newborn deer's, and he swayed slightly as the alcohol still coursed through his system, but he managed to stay upright with the officer's support. Corporal Whittaker watched silently from his post, his face unreadable, but his eyes betraying a flicker of relief. He had done his part, not as an enforcer of rules, but as a human being extending grace when it mattered most. Now, it was up to the authorities to handle the situation responsibly. Before stepping aside, however, Whittaker leaned forward ever so slightly, breaking protocol once again to address the officer in a low tone. "He's had a rough night," Whittaker murmured, keeping his voice steady. "He made a mistake, yes, but he's shown genuine remorse. Let's make sure we guide him rather than punish him unnecessarily." The officer nodded, clearly respecting Whittaker's judgment. Turning back to Mark, he gently guided him toward a quieter corner near the palace gates, away from the lingering stares of the crowd. There, they sat together on a cold stone bench, their breaths visible in the chilly air. The officer introduced himself as Sergeant Lewis and began speaking in a conversational tone, trying to put Mark at ease. "So, what's your name?" Lewis asked, his tone casual but probing. "M. Mark," came the shaky reply. "Well, Mark," Lewis continued, "you've had quite the evening. Care to tell me what's been going on?" At first, Mark hesitated, unsure how much to share, but something about Lewis's non-judgmental attitude encouraged him to open up. Slowly, haltingly, he began talking about the breakup, about feeling lost and angry, about using alcohol to numb the pain. Each word felt like lifting a heavy weight off his chest, and soon he found himself pouring out everything. The loneliness, the frustration, the sense of failure that had been eating away at him for weeks. Lewis listened intently, nodding occasionally and offering small words of encouragement. When Mark finally ran out of steam, his voice hoarse from crying and talking, Lewis leaned back slightly, letting the silence settle between them. Then, after a moment, he spoke. "I'm not going to lie to you, Mark," he said, his tone serious but not harsh. "What you did tonight was wrong. Throwing a bottle at a guard. That's dangerous behavior. It could have ended badly for everyone involved. But I also see that you're hurting, and sometimes people lash out because they don't know how else to cope. Does that sound about right?" Mark nodded, fresh tears welling up in his eyes. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he whispered. I don't know what happened. Everything got so messed up." "That happens sometimes," Lewis replied with a small, understanding smile. "Life throws curveballs, and we react in ways we regret later. But here's the thing, Mark. Regret can be a powerful teacher if you let it. You've already taken the first step by apologizing and owning up to your actions. Now, it's time to figure out how to move forward." Mark swallowed hard, his mind racing. Move forward? How could he possibly undo the damage he caused tonight? The thought seemed impossible, overwhelming. Sensing his hesitation, Lewis pressed on gently. "You're not alone in this," he said. "There are people who can help, counselors, support groups, even friends or family members you trust. And hey, If you need someone to talk to right now, I'm here. We'll figure this out together. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mark felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe he could turn things around. Maybe this disastrous night didn't have to define him. As he sat there, surrounded by strangers who had shown him more kindness than he thought he deserved, he realized something important. Change wasn't easy, but it was possible, and he was ready to try. After their heartfelt conversation on the cold stone bench, Sergeant Lewis helped Mark to his feet once again. This time, Mark stood a little taller, his steps steadier despite the lingering effects of alcohol. The weight on his shoulders hadn't completely disappeared, but it felt lighter, like he was carrying it differently now. As they walked away from the palace gates, the crowd had mostly dispersed, leaving only a few stragglers who glanced curiously before continuing on their way. Lewis guided Mark toward a quiet patrol car parked nearby, its blue lights casting soft reflections on the pavement. For a moment, Mark's heart sank. He braced himself for handcuffs or harsh words, assuming this was where his night would end, in the backseat of a police vehicle headed to the station. But instead of opening the rear door, Lewis gestured toward the front passenger seat. "Come on," he said with an encouraging nod. "Let's get you home." Mark froze, staring at him in disbelief. "You're not arresting me?" Lewis chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not tonight, Mark. Like I said earlier, you've already taken responsibility for your actions. Arresting you won't fix anything. It'll just add another layer of trouble to an already hard situation. Right now, what you need is rest and some clear thinking. We'll sort out the details later, but tonight, let's focus on getting you safe." Gratitude welled up inside Mark, threatening to bring another round of tears. He climbed into the passenger seat cautiously, as if afraid the offer might be revoked at any moment. Once settled, he looked over at Lewis, who gave him a reassuring smile before sliding behind the wheel. The engine hummed to life, and they pulled away from the palace, leaving the scene of Mark's chaos far behind. The ride was quiet but comfortable. Lewis didn't press Mark for more conversation. Instead, he turned on the radio to a low volume, filling the silence with soft music. Occasionally, he'd ask simple questions to keep Mark engaged. Where did he live? Did he have someone at home who could check on him? Each question was posed gently, without judgment, helping Mark stay grounded while giving him space to process everything that had happened. When they finally arrived at Mark's small flat, a modest building tucked into a quiet neighborhood, Lewis insisted on walking him inside. "Just to make sure you're okay," he explained when Mark protested weakly. Together, they climbed the creaky stairs to the second floor, where Mark fumbled with his keys before unlocking the door. Inside, the apartment was dimly lit and cluttered, evidence of weeks spent neglecting basic chores. Empty takeout containers littered the coffee table, and clothes were strewn across the couch. Despite the mess, Lewis didn't comment. Instead, he helped Mark settle onto the worn-out armchair near the window, ensuring he was stable before stepping back. "All right, here's the plan," Lewis said, pulling out a small notebook from his pocket. "Tomorrow morning, I want you to call this number." He scribbled something down and handed the slip of paper to Mark. "It's a counselor I trust. They specialize in helping people work through tough times like yours. No pressure, no judgment, just someone to listen and guide you." Mark took the paper with trembling hands, clutching it tightly as though it were a lifeline. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know why you're being so kind to me after everything I've done." Lewis knelt down beside him, meeting his gaze directly. "Because everyone deserves a second chance, Mark. You included. What you do with this opportunity is up to you. But I believe you can turn things around. Just promise me one thing. No more bottles. No more lashing out. Deal?" Mark nodded fervently, tears streaming down his face again. But this time, they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of hope, of gratitude, of relief. For the first time in months, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't entirely alone in his struggles. Before leaving, Lewis patted Mark on the shoulder one last time. "Get some rest," he said warmly. "And remember, tomorrow's a new day." As the door clicked shut behind Lewis, Mark sat there in the stillness of his apartment, clutching the piece of paper like it held the answers to all his problems. Outside, the city buzzed with life, oblivious to the transformation happening within those four walls. Mark knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to take the first step. The days that followed were a blur of reflection and resolve for Mark. After Sergeant Lewis left him at his apartment, Mark spent the entire night sitting in the dim glow of a table lamp, staring at the slip of paper with the counselor's number written on it. He replayed every moment of the chaotic evening in his mind. The beer bottle, the guard's calm response, the kindness of strangers who could have easily judged him, but chose not to. It was as if the universe had conspired to give him a wake-up call, and he wasn't about to ignore it. By morning, Mark's head throbbed from both the alcohol and the emotional storm he'd weathered, but his determination outweighed his discomfort. Taking a deep breath, he picked up his phone and dialed the number Lewis had given him. To his surprise, the counselor answered almost immediately, her voice warm and reassuring. She listened patiently as Mark haltingly explained what had happened, never interrupting or making him feel small. By the end of the call, they had scheduled an appointment for later that week. For the first time in ages, Mark felt like someone truly understood him. In the days leading up to the session, Mark began cleaning up, not just his apartment, but his life. He threw away the empty bottles, washed the dishes piled high in the sink, and even bought fresh groceries for the first time in weeks. Each small act of tidying felt symbolic, as though he was scrubbing away the layers of neglect and self-destruction that had built up over months. His flat started to look less like a refuge for despair and more like a place where hope could grow. But Mark knew he couldn't stop there. A few nights later, he sat down at his cluttered desk and pulled out a pen and paper. With trembling hands, he began writing a letter to Corporal James Whittaker. At first, the words came slowly, each sentence feeling inadequate compared to the depth of gratitude he wanted to express. But as he wrote, the floodgates opened, and soon the pages were filled with raw honesty. "Dear Corporal Whittaker," the letter began, "I don't know how to start this without sounding completely foolish, but I owe you an apology, and so much more than that. What I did to you that night was unforgivable, and yet you responded with a level of grace and understanding that I'll never forget. You didn't just stand there as a guard. You stood there as a human being, reminding me of the kind of person I want to be." He went on to explain how Whittaker's reaction had changed him, forcing him to confront his own behavior and inspiring him to seek help. "You taught me that strength isn't about fighting back. It's about choosing compassion when anger would be easier. I'll carry that lesson with me for the rest of my life," he wrote. Finally, after signing his name, Mark folded the letter carefully and mailed it to Buckingham Palace, unsure if it would ever reach its intended recipient. To his astonishment, a reply arrived 2 weeks later. The envelope bore the royal insignia, and inside was a handwritten note from Whittaker himself. "Dear Mark," it read, "thank you for your heartfelt letter. I'm glad to hear that you're taking steps toward healing. We all make mistakes, but owning them is the true measure of character. Remember, no one is defined solely by their worst moments. Keep moving forward. You are stronger than you think." Tears streamed down Mark's face as he read the words again and again. They weren't just a response to his apology. They were a message of encouragement, a reminder that redemption was possible. Inspired by Whittaker's kindness, Mark decided to take things further. He began volunteering at a local community center, helping others struggling with addiction and mental health issues. Sharing his story became therapeutic, not only for him, but also for those who needed proof that change was possible. Over time, Mark transformed. He cut ties with old habits, leaned into therapy, and embraced the idea of rebuilding his life piece by piece. Though scars remained from his past struggles, they no longer controlled him. Instead, they served as reminders of how far he'd come, a testament to the power of forgiveness, resilience, and the unexpected acts of humanity that can change everything. Months passed, and Mark's transformation became undeniable, not just to himself, but to everyone around him. The once disheveled man who had stumbled through the streets of London in anger and despair was now someone entirely different. His face carried a calmness it hadn't before, his eyes brighter with purpose. He no longer avoided mirrors or dreaded waking up each morning. Instead, he greeted each new day as an opportunity to grow, to give back, and to prove that people could change if they truly wanted to. At the community center where he volunteered, Mark quickly became a beacon of hope for others struggling with their own battles. Whether it was leading group discussions, offering one-on-one support, or simply sharing coffee with someone who needed to talk, he poured his heart into helping others find their way out of darkness. Many attendees were surprised when they learned about his past. The same man who had once hurled a beer bottle at a royal guard was now inspiring them to take control of their lives. It wasn't easy for Mark to share his story, especially the parts he felt most ashamed of, but he knew it mattered. Seeing the impact his words had on others made every moment worth it. One evening, after a particularly moving session at the center, Mark received an unexpected invitation in the mail. It was addressed to him personally, bearing the official seal of Buckingham Palace. His hands trembled as he opened it, half expecting another note from Corporal Whittaker. But this time, the letter contained something extraordinary. An invitation to attend a small gathering hosted by members of the royal household to honor individuals who had turned their lives around and contributed positively to society. Mark couldn't believe it. Him, invited to Buckingham Palace. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just months earlier, he'd been standing outside those very gates, drunk and angry, throwing insults and objects at the guards. Now he was being recognized for overcoming his struggles and making a difference. Tears welled up in his eyes as he read the letter over and over again, overwhelmed by gratitude and disbelief. The day of the event arrived, and Mark dressed carefully, wanting to look presentable for such a monumental occasion. As he walked through the palace gates, memories flooded back. The chaos, the shame, the kindness of Corporal Whittaker. This time, however, there was no fear or regret in his heart, only pride and humility. Inside, he was warmly welcomed by staff and introduced to several dignitaries and representatives from charitable organizations. They spoke to him about his work at the community center, praising his dedication and resilience. And then, as if fate had orchestrated it perfectly, Mark found himself face to face with Corporal James Whittaker. For a moment, neither of them said anything. They simply exchanged a knowing smile, the kind that transcended words. Finally, Whittaker extended his hand, and Mark shook it firmly, feeling the deep sense of closure wash over him. "I'm proud of you," Whittaker said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "You've come a long way." "Thank you," Mark replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without your example." As the evening drew to a close, Mark stepped outside, taking in the grandeur of Buckingham Palace one last time. The air was crisp, much like it had been that fateful night, but this time, it felt refreshing rather than suffocating. He realized how far he'd come, not because of luck or chance, but because he had chosen to confront his pain, seek help, and embrace the lessons life had thrown his way. That night, as Mark lay in bed reflecting on everything that had happened, he thought about the ripple effect of kindness. If Corporal Whittaker hadn't responded with patience instead of anger, would Mark have ever found the courage to change? Would he still be stuck in the same cycle of self-destruction? He didn't know for sure, but one thing was certain. Acts of compassion, no matter how small, could spark monumental transformations. From that point forward, Mark vowed to carry that lesson with him always, to treat others with the same understanding and grace that had saved him. Life wasn't perfect, and challenges still arose, but Mark faced them head-on, armed with the knowledge that even in humanity's darkest moments, Redemption was always within reach.